Hi there, I'm Emily with the Gulf Council, and this is a public hearing video designed to get your comments on Reef Fish Amendment 63, which considers creating a 3-year pilot program for a red grouper commercial quota pool. So we'll just start with the purpose and need. So the purpose is to establish a 3-year pilot commercial red grouper individual fishing quota pool, and then to distribute the resulting annual allocation to eligible participants in the grouper tilefish IFQ program. We are doing this in hopes of enhancing economic profitability and reducing discards by improving access to red grouper annual allocation by fishermen who are engaged in the commercial harvest of red grouper, and also to provide new opportunities for obtaining red grouper annual allocation. So a couple of logistics to consider before we sort of dive in. So first, this quota pool would be established using a portion of the quota that is expected to be increased from Reef Fish Amendment 62. You'll see on this table over here, our current red grouper quota is 2.79 million pounds. What you'll see is that in 2027, we expect Reef Fish Amendment 62 to be implemented, which will increase the red grouper commercial quota, as you can see in this table. So I also want to be clear that red grouper quota that is not used for the quota pool is going to be distributed as usual, right? Based on the percentage of owner or share ownership. I also want to point out that distribution will be based on the previous 2 qualifying years on a rolling basis, distribution of this quota pool. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and what that looks like. I have a table to show you. And then finally, I do want to say that in order to address potential appeals from this quota pool, 10% of the quota would be initially withheld each year. That is in order to allow people to appeal, right? So participants would have 30 days to appeal their landings in the IFQ system. Then distributions amounts would be solely based on transactions within the IFQ program. And then I also need to say that hardships will not be considered for appeals because we're using that 2-year rolling basis. So let's jump right into action 1. And the first alternative is the no action alternative. And that would just not establish this commercial pool for red grouper. And that would mean that the entirety of the commercial red grouper quota would continue to be allocated based on current IFQ share ownership and percentages. There are 3 other alternatives that we can consider here, and mind you, I will have some sub options that we'll discuss, but we'll do that later. We're just going to focus on these main alternatives first. So alternative 2 would establish a commercial quota pool in 2027 for red grouper. And what it would do though is if the commercial quota is at or below 2.79 million pounds, then the quota pool would be set to 0. So there would not be a quota pool if we're at or below 2.79 million pounds, which is the current quota before the anticipated increase from the implementation of Amendment 62. Then, if it is above that threshold, the pool would hold a percentage that we have to pick of quota above that same threshold, that 2.79 million pounds. And you can see what that looks like on this infographic over here. So preferred alternative 3 is a little bit different in that it would establish a quota pool, but it would use a different threshold for whether or not to establish it, right? So if the commercial quota is at or below 4.28 million pounds, then the quota pool would be set to 0. So that 4.28 million pounds is what we expect the quota to be after Amendment 62 is implemented for the year 2027. But the trick here is that if that threshold is met, that 4.28 million pound threshold is met for the overall commercial quota, then the quota pool would be established, but it would be established and filled based on that 2.79 million pounds. So anything above 2.79 million pounds would then be used to create the quota pool. And you can see that again in this infographic. The fourth alternative is a little bit different in that it uses 4.28 million pounds as the threshold for whether or not there will be a quota pool, but then it also would populate the quota pool from anything above that level. So that one really focuses on if we have 4.28 million pounds or above, we will have a quota pool, and the quota pool would be created above that level as well. And again, you can look at this infographic and hopefully that helps. So these sub-options that we would be able to consider for each alternative are to figure out what percentage of the commercial red grouper quota increase above the threshold we would like to use. So option A would be to establish that quota pool with 15% of the commercial red grouper increase. Alternative B, which is the council's preferred, would use 20%. Option C would be 25%, and option D would be 30%. This table shows you a comparison of what the quota pool would look like under the different alternatives and options. So alternative 2 and 3, since they use that 2.79 million pound threshold, they have the same values. We've also highlighted here the 20%, which is the current preferred alternative for the council there. You can also look at alternative 4 and what the resulting values would be above that 4.28 million pounds. And this just shows you under preferred alternative 3, option 3B, what the resulting amounts are for the total commercial quota, the amount that would be put into the quota pool, and the amount that would be remaining and distributed as normal minus the quota pool. Action 2, we're going to move on to talking about eligibility criteria for participation. The first alternative is always the no action alternative. The second alternative would be that in order to receive annual allocation for the quota pool, IFQ account holders must possess a valid or renewable commercial permit, and they must have a minimum of red grouper landing during the 2-year reference period. And I just want to pause for a minute and show you that reference period. If you can see here, like for 2027, it'll be the qualifying years of 2025 and 2026, and then it sort of keeps rolling as we move down the calendar. Now the sub options here would be addressing how many pounds of minimum landings we would want in order to qualify for this pool. So option 2A would be 300 pounds. Option 2B, which is the council's preferred, would be 500 pounds. And then you could also go with option 2C, which would be a minimum of 1,000 pounds of landings in order to qualify for participation in this quota pool. And here you'll just see a comparison of the accounts with shares and accounts without shares that would be eligible based on the different minimum landings options that could be selected. I did bold 500 pounds because that's the council's current preferred. I also want to be clear that this is based on landings from 23-24 and would likely change with implementation of the program to the more recent actual qualifying years. So finally, we move to action 3 and distribution of the quota pool. So alternative 1 is our no action alternative that would not distribute quota to eligible participants. Alternative 2 would distribute 60-40. So 60% of the quota pool would be distributed among fishermen that have a reef fish permit and also have red grouper landings within that reference period, but do not own grouper shares. And then 40% would be distributed to those people that do have a commercial reef fish permit, they do have the qualifying minimum landings, but they do own red grouper shares. So it's 60-40. And then alternative 3, which is the council's preferred alternative, would use those same two groups, those that do have shares and those do not, but it would distribute it 50-50 among those two groups. These sub options here are looking at how you would distribute to the individual accounts or participants. Option A looks at distributing to those that have no red grouper shares or do not have shares. Option B looks at those who do have shares. And you could either distribute equally amongst all of the qualifying participants, or the council's current preferred for both those that do and do not have shares would be to distribute quota from the quota pool proportionally based on the red grouper landings that they have during that 2-year reference period. Now I do want to take mention that red grouper quota or the annual allocation that is distributed from the quota pool is not transferable. And this table shows you, based on our preferred alternative, what the entire red grouper quota pool would look like and then how it would be distributed, and you can see it's 50-50, so it would be equal among accounts with red grouper shares and accounts without red grouper shares. And finally, this is a comparison of the preferred alternatives, and if you look at the yellow here, this would show you how many pounds you could expect with that 50-50 split for distribution among those that do have shares and those that don't. And then based on proportional landing. So what you'll see is with those minimum of 500 qualifying pounds, participants are going to end up receiving anywhere between 66 and 15,000 pounds if they do have shares. And then those without shares are going to receive anywhere from 36 to 10,000 pounds. So the council plans to take final action on this during their June council meeting, but they would like to hear your comments beforehand. You can send us your comment in one of two ways. First, you can visit us online and you can either use this QR code or this quick link to submit comments online, or you can simply email us at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and send us your thoughts.